The skies over Europe and the Pacific in 1943 were a theater of precision, speed, and fear. German and Axis pilots, veterans of countless dogfights, prided themselves on the elegance and lethality of their machines. Messerschmitt Bf 109s sliced through clouds like knives through silk. Focke-Wulfs danced with the wind, agile and deadly. Against such predators, a newcomer was supposed to inspire awe. Instead, it sparked laughter. When the first intelligence reports reached Luftwaffe officers about a new American carrier-based fighter, the Grumman F6F Hellcat, disbelief and ridicule followed in equal measure. "A lumbering beast," one pilot scoffed in a crowded briefing room. "Look at that fuselage, like a barn on wings." Another sneered at its radial engine, convinced it could never match the speed of the Luftwaffe's agile aces. From the cockpit, it seemed almost comical. The Hellcat was wider, taller, heavier. Its bulky frame contrasted sharply with the razor-thin fuselages of the German fighters. Axis intelligence analysts derided its armor, its range, even its guns. "The Americans are building toys," muttered a veteran officer, rolling his eyes at the schematics. There was a sense, pervasive and dangerous, that this new plane could be dismissed without thought. Yet beneath that facade of mockery, the Americans had a different vision. Grumman engineers, battle-hardened from earlier designs like the F4F Wildcat, had studied every enemy tactic, every weakness in Japanese and European air strategies. They knew the Hellcat would not win by elegance alone. It would win by resilience, by firepower, by sheer tactical advantage. Its designers had anticipated the criticisms, engineering a machine that could shrug off hits, that would cripple lighter fighters, climb faster under load, and deliver devastating bursts of 50 caliber rounds. The pilots assigned to the Hellcat were trained with an almost religious precision. Every maneuver, every barrel roll, every dive was calculated to exploit the weaknesses of the enemy planes. While the Axis laughed, the Americans were quietly mastering the skies, turning what seemed a clumsy machine into a predator that would soon dominate the Pacific and terrorize Axis pilots wherever it appeared. This psychological undercurrent, mockery masking underestimation, was the first strategic victory. Enemy arrogance would be exploited mercilessly. When the Hellcat finally roared into combat, German and Japanese pilots would be forced to confront not just a plane, but a machine born of meticulous analysis, relentless testing, and the unforgiving calculus of war. The first combat reports trickled in, almost unremarkable on paper. A Hellcat engages a Mitsubishi Zero. A brief skirmish, the enemy spirals down, smoke trailing into the horizon. But the pilots back in Europe and the Pacific could not yet grasp the scale of what they were witnessing. Each report hinted at something quietly terrifying, the rise of a fighter designed not to impress, but to survive, strike, and dominate. And so, the world's airmen laughed. They mocked the Hellcat. They called it a clumsy, overweight curiosity. Yet somewhere in the hangars of the U.S. Navy, a predator waited patiently for its moment. One day, that laughter would turn to panic, confusion, and a desperate scramble for survival. But behind the mockery, the Americans had quietly built a predator. December 7th, 1941, dawned with a roar of fire and steel. Pearl Harbor, shattered and smoldering, left the U.S. Pacific Fleet reeling. Aircraft carriers, the linchpin of naval dominance, were suddenly exposed, fragile against an enemy that had perfected the art of aerial warfare. The skies belonged to the Japanese, and their Mitsubishi Zeros, sleek and ruthless, hunted without mercy. American pilots, still reeling from the surprise attack, took to their outdated Grumman F4F Wildcats with grim determination. The Wildcat, sturdy but slow, could endure punishment, but speed and maneuverability were in short supply. Against the Zeros, it was a mismatch, a lion trying to outrun a panther. Every engagement brought losses. Every sortie highlighted the stark reality. America's carriers could not survive without a fighter capable of tipping the balance. The situation was more than tactical. It was psychological. Confidence was eroding, discipline tested, and morale fragile. Commanders debated long nights over charts and reports. Fleet commanders demanded a solution, a fighter that could dominate in the air, protect carriers, and withstand the enemy's brutal precision. Every failed engagement was a lesson written in blood. Every downed pilot a warning that the U.S. Navy could not afford delay. Engineers and designers on the East Coast felt the pressure acutely. In a Long Island factory, far from the front lines, sketches began to fill the drafting tables. This was not the work of vanity or mere innovation. It was a response to desperation, a calculated attempt to design a weapon that could survive the worst the enemy could throw at it. The goal was clear: build a fighter that could climb faster, dive harder, take punishment, and strike with deadly efficiency. The requirements were almost contradictory. The plane needed the bulk to absorb damage, yet retain agility. The power to accelerate rapidly, yet remain stable on carrier decks. The guns to devastate enemy formations, yet allow precise control in dogfights. The stakes were staggering. Every decision made in that factory carried the weight of lives, fleets, and the fragile hope of turning the tide in the Pacific. Meanwhile, across the ocean, Japanese pilots continued to assert aerial dominance. Every encounter with a Wildcat confirmed the pressing need for change. The U.S. Navy's carriers, vulnerable and exposed, depended on the speed of innovation, on engineers daring to challenge convention, and on pilots ready to master whatever beast emerged from the hangars. The crisis was not only material, but existential. Each day, the Zeros ruled the skies. America's position weakened, its dreams of turning the tide of the war slipping further from reach. Commanders and engineers alike understood that survival demanded more than bravery. It demanded a radical reinvention of carrier warfare. And in a Long Island factory, engineers began sketching a beast of the seas. By 1942, the U.S. Navy's desperation had become a clarion call for innovation. In the heart of Grumman's Long Island factory, engineers faced a singular mission: design a fighter that could not merely compete, but dominate the skies over the Pacific. Elegance was irrelevant. Speed alone was insufficient. Survival, firepower, and sheer operational superiority were the only measures that mattered. The Grumman F6F Hellcat emerged not as a bird of beauty, but as a predator born of hard lessons. Its frame was robust, almost cumbersome at first glance, yet every curve and rivet served a purpose. Armor reinforced the cockpit and engine, shielding the pilot from enemy bullets that would incapacitate lighter aircraft. Every panel, every joint was tested to withstand the stress of carrier operations, abrupt landings, catapult launches, and the unforgiving pitch of the sea. Power was the heartbeat of the design. At its core roared a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp radial engine, capable of producing 2,000 horsepower. The result was an aircraft that could accelerate and climb with brutal force, outpacing every Japanese fighter it was likely to face. In dogfights, this power would allow pilots to dictate engagements, to climb above the enemy, and to strike with the confidence of someone who knew the odds were in their favor. Armament was calculated for maximum devastation. 650 caliber Browning machine guns lined the wings, delivering a volume of fire that could shred enemy aircraft in seconds. Every bullet was a carefully considered instrument of survival, designed to turn a brief encounter into a decisive victory. Engineers studied enemy tactics meticulously, ensuring that the Hellcat's weapons complemented its speed and durability. Carrier operability was another key factor. Unlike smaller, lighter fighters that risked structural failure during landings, the Hellcat absorbed impact and stress with surprising grace. Its rugged landing gear, reinforced fuselage, and forgiving stall characteristics made it ideal for pilots operating under extreme conditions. Limited runway space, turbulent seas, and the constant threat of enemy attack. In the chaos of naval warfare, these practicalities would mean the difference between life and death. Yet despite these advantages, there was an undeniable psychological challenge. The plane was not beautiful. Its bulk and angular lines were a far cry from the sleek silhouettes German pilots revered. The Hellcat looked almost ungainly, a barnyard cat masquerading as a lion. Axis observers initially mocked its appearance, dismissing it as clumsy, heavy, and ill-suited for combat. But design was only part of the story. A machine is nothing without the men who pilot it. Grumman's engineers understood this too. They worked not just on metal and mechanics, but on creating a platform that instilled confidence. Every flight test, every simulated engagement reinforced the aircraft's strengths and prepared pilots to exploit them fully. They trained with an understanding of psychology as much as aerodynamics. A pilot who trusts his machine is already halfway to victory. By late 1942, the Hellcat was ready for testing, ready to prove that a fighter could survive punishment, deliver overwhelming firepower, and dominate carrier warfare without grace or elegance. The question that lingered, whispered among naval officers and engineers alike, was not about specifications or performance charts. It was about the crucible of combat itself. Now the question was, could this ungainly cat fight? By early 1943, the Pacific had become a proving ground, where survival hinged on split-second decisions and machine performance. The first squadrons of Hellcats rolled off carriers, their engines throbbing with raw power, ready to face the skies where Japanese Mitsubishi Zeros had long ruled with terrifying grace. For pilots who had flown the slower, lightly armored Wildcats, this was a revelation, an entirely new calculus of combat. The initial encounters were electric with tension. Patrols launched into sun-scorched skies, clouds slicing the horizon, the roar of engines filling the cockpit like an anthem of impending chaos. Japanese fighters swooped with practiced precision, expecting easy prey. They had faced American aircraft before, and history had taught them arrogance could be rewarded. But the Hellcat was not the Wildcat. It was a predator, engineered to survive, to dominate, and to deliver death with brutal efficiency. Combat revealed the Hellcat's true strengths. Its 650 caliber machine guns tore through enemy formations with terrifying consistency. Pilots reported that a single short burst could turn a Zero into a fireball trailing smoke, its elegant silhouette reduced to wreckage mid-air. The plane's armor was equally transformative. Bullets that would have shattered the cockpit of a Wildcat bounced off the Hellcat's reinforced panels. Pilots returned from sorties alive, sometimes with the fuselage peppered like a sieve, a testament to its rugged design. The psychological impact was immediate. Where morale had once faltered under the relentless dominance of the Zeros, confidence surged. Pilots learned to fight aggressively, knowing their aircraft could absorb punishment and strike decisively. Losses dropped. Kills skyrocketed. Each sortie became a statement. The Pacific skies were no longer a one-sided battlefield. The Hellcat was changing the rules of engagement, turning desperation into strategy, fear into calculated aggression. Tactically, the Hellcat allowed the U.S. Navy to reclaim initiative. Pilots could climb above the enemy, dive to attack with precision, and pull away before Zeros could retaliate effectively. Carrier fleets, once vulnerable, gained a defensive edge that had been unimaginable a year earlier. Commanders observed these shifts with cautious optimism, aware that a single technological leap could reshape an entire theater of war. Yet, even as victories mounted, the broader strategic picture remained complex. Japanese forces were formidable, disciplined, and resilient. Every triumph in the skies was a momentary reprieve, a brief assertion of superiority in a war defined by attrition and adaptation. The Hellcat's emergence was decisive, but it was also a signal to the world. American ingenuity, patience, and relentless engineering could produce not just a fighter, but a weapon that redefined the very notion of aerial combat. While pilots celebrated their initial success, the Axis powers were watching from afar. Reports of Hellcat dominance filtered through intelligence networks in Europe and Asia, causing quiet unease. German and Japanese officers dismissed early claims as exaggeration, yet the growing body of combat data could not be ignored. The Hellcat was more than a fighter. It was a symbol of American industrial might and tactical foresight, a machine that could challenge conventional expectations on any battlefield. But while it crushed Japan, another enemy was watching from afar. By late 1943, reports of American victories in the Pacific had reached German intelligence offices in Berlin and beyond. The F6F Hellcat, a bulky carrier fighter, was being credited with a rising kill count against Japanese Zeros, a plane that seemed to rewrite the rules of aerial warfare. Yet, in the high command rooms and briefing halls of the Luftwaffe, these reports were met with skepticism, even amusement. Veteran officers pored over combat logs, intercepting radio reports and translating eyewitness accounts from the Pacific. Their analysis was clinical but dismissive. "A lumbering toy," one colonel wrote in the margins of a briefing dossier. "Not a threat to the finesse of our Bf-109s or FW-190s. Naval aviation cannot survive in true European skies." Another officer scoffed at the notion that American ingenuity could compensate for clumsy design. The Hellcat, they concluded, was a product of desperation, tailored for the expansive ocean, not the tight, treacherous dogfighting of the European theater. There was a kernel of truth to their assessment, but also a dangerous arrogance. Luftwaffe pilots were unrivaled in experience, their machines finely tuned for speed, agility, and precision. Compared to these aces, a heavier, slower aircraft seemed almost laughable. Mockery became the default lens through which they viewed the Pacific reports. Officers compared photographs, noting the Hellcat's bulk, its wide wingspan, its radial engine, and its comparatively cumbersome landing gear. "How can such a plane survive in Europe?" they mused aloud. But their dismissal overlooked subtler truths. The very qualities that made the Hellcat formidable against the Zeros were not limited to the Pacific. Armor, firepower, and engine power did not care for geography. What was considered clumsy in one theater could prove unstoppable in another if used correctly. Yet German confidence blinded them. They believed that American production might flood the skies. But that individual skill, tactical doctrine, and superior aircraft design would neutralize any threat. Behind closed doors, a few forward-thinking officers raised warnings. There were discussions, cautious and brief, suggesting that perhaps the Americans had engineered a plane capable of more than anyone realized. They examined its engine specifications, noting the 2,000 horsepower radial, and speculated on its potential climb rate and durability. Still, these voices were drowned out by the prevailing consensus. The Hellcat was a curiosity, a Pacific anomaly, a machine unfit to challenge Luftwaffe veterans, hardened by years of European combat. Meanwhile, American engineers and pilots, unaware of the skepticism brewing in Berlin, continued refining tactics and sharing combat experiences. Every sortie sharpened their understanding of the aircraft's capabilities. Each encounter, each kill, reinforced the growing legend of a plane that could not only survive, but dominate. Across the Atlantic, German officers could not yet feel the full weight of the threat that was slowly taking shape on carriers and airfields. Confidence, pride, and a sense of invincibility shielded them from imagining the Hellcat as a serious adversary. The mocking tone persisted, and reports of its ferocity were treated as exaggeration. Yet beneath that dismissive exterior, the seeds of caution had been planted. The Luftwaffe's hubris, as formidable as it was, would soon be challenged, not by numbers alone, but by an aircraft that refused to conform to conventional expectations of elegance, speed, and maneuverability. That illusion would not last long. By early 1944, the Atlantic theater had become a crucible of relentless pressure and constant threat. German U-boats prowled shipping lanes, and Luftwaffe patrols challenged every Allied movement with disciplined efficiency. The Allies' carriers were stretched thin, convoys vulnerable, and the need for a fighter that could dominate both air and sea was urgent. Into this theatre came the F6F Hellcat, no longer a distant curiosity, but a weapon poised to reshape the balance. Deployments began cautiously. U.S. Navy pilots carried the lessons of the Pacific into the Atlantic, adapting tactics to narrower skies, unpredictable weather, and the shadow of European fortifications. Convoy escort became a primary mission. Hellcats streaked across grey seas, their engines roaring with uncompromising power, scanning the horizon for the telltale silhouettes of German fighters or the sinister wake of U-boats. These missions demanded precision, discipline, and unflinching resolve, qualities the Hellcat was designed to support. Initial encounters with the Luftwaffe were revelatory. Pilots who had dismissed the aircraft as unwieldy found themselves facing Hellcats that climbed with astonishing force, rode decisively, and unleashed devastating broadsides from their 650 caliber guns. German pilots, expecting easy prey, suddenly discovered that these American toys could outpace, outgun, and outlast their most skilled maneuvers. The psychological impact was immediate. Confidence gave way to hesitation, and hesitation in aerial combat often proves fatal. Hellcats began to escort convoys with near-impervious dominance. U-boat hunters found the aircraft particularly effective. Low-altitude strafing runs and bombing support rendered previously safe patrol areas treacherous. German pilots had to rethink traditional engagement tactics. The lessons of the Pacific, once dismissed as irrelevant to European airspace, now became undeniable. These fighters were no longer a novelty. They were a strategic tool, engineered for survival and designed to project lethal force wherever needed. The Allies, too, adapted. RAF and U.S. Navy pilots shared intelligence, exchanging reports on optimal formation strategies, fuel management, and engagement protocols. Pilots trained to maximize the Hellcat's climbing power, exploiting the R-2800 engine to seize altitude advantage before unleashing coordinated strikes. Each sortie became a tactical study in control, discipline, and lethal precision. The aircraft's reputation grew not only through raw numbers, but through the psychological edge it gave pilots over an enemy previously unchallenged in these skies. As sorties multiplied, German officers could no longer afford to dismiss reports as exaggeration. Letters from Luftwaffe pilots described unexpected ferocity, while debriefings noted aircraft that shrugged off hits previously considered fatal. The clumsy caricature once mocked in Berlin, the overweight, ungainly Hellcat, was now a predator in European skies, a disruptor capable of dismantling well-practiced patrol formations with alarming efficiency. By late 1944, these deployments reached the French coast and the Low Countries. Convoys escorted by Hellcats sailed with unprecedented confidence. Luftwaffe formations, once arrogant and precise, found themselves shadowed by waves of heavily armed fighters that refused to yield. Pilots who had once laughed at the plane's bulk now confronted an unyielding adversary, fast, durable, and lethal in every maneuver. The Atlantic had become the proving ground, and the Hellcat's psychological dominance was as formidable as its physical capabilities. Every engagement reinforced a singular truth: design, power, and tactical deployment could overcome even the most seasoned opponents. German aces learned through costly experience that mocking an enemy's appearance was a dangerous gamble, and one that the Americans had deliberately engineered them to lose. The transition from curiosity to fear was swift, unrelenting, and total, and when Hellcats crossed into occupied Europe, the laughter stopped. By the final months of the Second World War, the F6F Hellcat had etched itself into aviation history with a record that seemed almost unreal. Across the vast expanses of the Pacific, and now in the Atlantic and European theaters, the aircraft demonstrated a lethal efficiency that was both mechanical and psychological. For every Hellcat lost, nearly 20 enemy planes were destroyed, a staggering kill ratio that underscored the gulf between anticipation and reality. Early skepticism had given way to astonishment. Pilots who once doubted the Hellcat's bulk and unconventional design now trusted it implicitly. They relied on its armored fuselage to absorb enemy fire, on its powerful R2800 engine to seize the upper hand in climbs and dives, and on its 650 caliber machine guns to impose instant and decisive punishment. Each engagement reinforced the tactical doctrine Grumman engineers and U.S. Navy strategists had cultivated. Survive, strike, dominate. Combat reports, meticulously logged and analyzed, painted a grim tableau for the Japanese and German forces alike. In the Pacific, Zeros that had once ruled the skies fell with unerring regularity. In the Atlantic, Luftwaffe pilots found themselves outmatched, outgunned, and outmaneuvered despite their skill. The numbers did not lie. The kill ratio of 19-1 was more than statistics. It was a narrative of technological foresight. Pilot training and industrial might converging in a single, terrifying predator. Psychologically, the effect on enemy forces was profound. Morale faltered in units confronted by repeated losses to what had once been dismissed as a clumsy, overweight fighter. Veteran aces faced a machine that could absorb punishment, strike decisively, and retreat unscathed, a combination that undermined confidence, disrupted strategy, and forced constant recalibration of tactics. No longer could pilots rely solely on skill. The Hellcat demanded respect, even fear. For U.S. pilots, this dominance was more than numerical. It instilled a sense of control in theaters where uncertainty and death had once been constant companions. Each kill validated the painstaking training and the meticulous engineering that had produced the aircraft. Survival was no longer an accident of skill or luck. It was a tangible result of superior design meeting disciplined execution. By late 1944 and into 1945, the Luftwaffe's calculations had to change. Every lost aircraft represented a pilot, a veteran, a tactical advantage irretrievably gone. The enemy's arrogance, which had dismissed the Hellcat as irrelevant, now transformed into a calculated anxiety. They faced a force that combined technological supremacy with psychological dominance, a combination that left them vulnerable even before the first shot was fired. As historians would later recount, the Hellcat's kill ratio was not simply a statistic, it was the story of a fighter that had reshaped aerial warfare, turning mockery into mastery and skepticism into devastation. One plane, multiplied across squadrons, became a force that dictated strategy and dictated survival. Numbers the Luftwaffe could no longer afford. By 1945, the reputation of the F6F Hellcat had transcended statistics. It was no longer just a fighter. It was a symbol of industrial precision, engineering foresight, and human adaptability. Its dominance in the air was not the result of sleek lines or elegant aerobatics. It was the result of a design philosophy rooted in survival, firepower, and accessibility. The Hellcat's armor was its first secret weapon. Pilots emerged from dogfights that would have destroyed other fighters virtually unscathed. Bullets ricocheted off reinforced panels. Vital systems were protected by careful placement and redundant structures. In a war where a single miscalculation could end a life, this ruggedness transformed fear into confidence. Pilots learned to push the machine to its limits, knowing that their survival was engineered into every rivet and bolt. Equally lethal was its armament. 650 caliber Browning machine guns, mounted along the wings, delivered a volume of fire that could obliterate enemy aircraft in seconds. Accuracy, combined with rate of fire, meant that even fleeting windows in a dogfight could be exploited decisively. Unlike earlier fighters that demanded near-perfect aim or multiple passes, the Hellcat allowed pilots to dominate with both precision and brute force. Each burst reinforced a grim reality for enemy pilots. Survival required more than skill. It required evasion against an opponent built to endure and strike back, but power and armor alone would not have been enough. The Hellcat was also remarkably forgiving, a critical factor for training and operational efficiency. Its airframe absorbed mistakes, mishandled landings, and novice errors with surprising grace. Rookie pilots, under the stress of combat, could manage maneuvers that would cripple lighter aircraft. This accessibility expanded the pool of capable aviators and ensured that attrition, an inevitable part of war, was mitigated by design. The fighter was a workhorse, not a diva, capable of performing reliably across theaters and conditions where others might falter. Every sortie reinforced the psychological weight of the aircraft. Enemy pilots, who had once dismissed it as ungainly, began to re-evaluate. Reports filtered back from the Pacific and Atlantic theaters describing planes that could shrug off damage, strike with unerring efficiency, and return their pilots safely to carriers. For the first time, Luftwaffe and Japanese aces began to fear the mechanical reliability of the machine as much as the skill of the pilot. The Hellcat's resilience became a force multiplier, turning even inexperienced aviators into credible threats. The synergy of armor, firepower, and forgiving flight characteristics created a fighter that transcended the conventional limits of war machines. It was not a plane that relied on beauty, finesse, or showmanship. It relied on fundamentals, survivability, lethality, and reliability, executed with precision. Its success was methodical, predictable, and devastating, yet it carried an element of psychological terror that amplified its effectiveness. Enemy confidence eroded before the first shot was fired. By the end of the engagement, pilots faced a machine that seemed indestructible, omnipresent, and unrelenting. By early 1945, whispers circulated among German aces. Accounts once dismissed as exaggeration or propaganda were now being scrutinized in the field. This clumsy toy, mocked in intelligence reports and briefing rooms, was something far more dangerous, a killer engineered to survive, dominate, and decisively tip the scales in any engagement. Even German aces began to whisper, this clumsy toy was a killer. By March 1945, the Hellcat's arrival in Europe was more than an introduction, it was a reckoning. American carriers and forward airfields projected power deep into occupied territories, and German pilots who had once mocked the aircraft were confronted with a harsh reality. The skies they had once dominated were no longer theirs. The F6F, battle-tested across oceans, now prowled the European theater with the same lethal efficiency, and the Luftwaffe's pride began to crumble. The German Air Force faced compounded pressures. Years of relentless fighting on the Eastern Front had drained both pilots and resources. Experienced aces were killed or grounded, replaced by young men with minimal training. Fuel shortages limited sorties, leaving formations fragmented and vulnerable. Against this backdrop, the Hellcat's consistency and reliability became a strategic weapon of overwhelming force. Unlike the Luftwaffe's increasingly fragile aircraft, the Hellcat could be counted on to perform under any conditions, over and over again. With predictable lethality, engagements in the skies over France, the Low Countries, and the Ruhr illustrated the widening gap. Hellcats escorted bombers and convoys, hunting any Luftwaffe presence with surgical precision. German pilots, once confident in their superior maneuverability, found themselves outgunned and outmatched. The combination of rugged armor, devastating firepower, and a forgiving airframe allowed American aviators to execute aggressive tactics without the catastrophic losses that had once plagued their predecessors. Each confrontation was a microcosm of an industrial and psychological imbalance that the Luftwaffe could neither reverse nor fully comprehend. The collapse of morale was as crucial as the collapse of machines. Pilots who had relied on experience and skill alone now faced aircraft designed to survive punishment and to dominate relentlessly. Every engagement eroded confidence, forcing the Luftwaffe to adopt defensive and cautious tactics, an uncharacteristic departure from the audacious strikes that had defined earlier campaigns. Losses mounted, and the once mighty Luftwaffe became reactive, fragmented, and demoralized. April 1945 brought the final demonstration of Hellcat supremacy with the collapse of the Ruhr pocket. Allied air power, supported by relentless sorties of F6Fs, controlled the skies and denied the Luftwaffe any opportunity for effective resistance. German formations were decimated, ground movements exposed, and the tactical advantage firmly in Allied hands. Pilots reported entire squadrons destroyed or grounded, their aircraft unable to withstand the sustained pressure of a mass-produced, meticulously engineered Predator. The psychological impact was total. The Luftwaffe's confidence, its pride, and its tactical doctrine were shattered in a matter of weeks. By the war's final days, the Hellcat had proven more than a technological marvel. It had become a symbol of relentless strategy, industrial foresight, and human ingenuity. Its pilots, trained to exploit every advantage, had not only survived, but dominated every theater it entered. German pilots, who once mocked the design, dismissing it as a clumsy toy, now acknowledged its deadly efficiency in hushed tones. The narratives of arrogance and dismissal that had colored intelligence reports were replaced by respect, caution, and a grudging recognition of the Hellcat's supremacy. And when the war ended, the Hellcat's reputation was sealed forever. In the final analysis, the F6F Hellcat was never meant to captivate with elegance. It did not glide with the grace of a Spitfire, nor boast the sleek menace of a Messerschmitt. Its lines were functional, its bulk conspicuous, its presence commanding rather than beautiful. Yet in the unforgiving calculus of war, beauty was irrelevant. The Hellcat's genius lay not in aesthetics, but in its perfect equilibrium of power, survivability, and production. Across oceans, from the Pacific to the Atlantic, it had rewritten the rules of aerial combat. Its R-2800 engine roared with the relentless force of industrial might, propelling the aircraft above enemies who had once assumed the skies were theirs. Its 650 caliber machine guns unleashed a torrent of fire that demanded respect, punishing even the most skilled opposition with merciless efficiency. Pilots who climbed into its cockpit discovered a machine that absorbed punishment, endured stress, and delivered victory in ways no lighter, more delicate fighter could. It was a warhorse designed for survival and for dominance. The human element was inseparable from this machine. Pilots trusted the Hellcat instinctively, relying on its rugged construction to survive encounters that would have destroyed lesser aircraft. Confidence bred aggression, precision, and audacity. Novice aviators, guided by forgiving flight characteristics, could confront seasoned opponents without falling prey to panic or error. Experience and innovation converged in the cockpit, making the Hellcat not just a tool of war, but a force multiplier, magnifying the impact of every pilot who took to the skies. The transformation was equally psychological. German and Japanese forces had once mocked the Hellcat, dismissing it as a clumsy, overweight toy. Yet laughter gave way to apprehension, apprehension to respect, and respect ultimately to fear. Axis pilots faced a Predator that refused to falter, a machine that consistently struck with precision, and an industrial engine that replaced losses faster than they could be inflicted. Mockery became disbelief. Disbelief gave way to desperation. And by the war's end, silence, a grudging acknowledgement of superiority, settled over the reports once scrawled with scorn. Mass production was a hidden weapon in itself. No single pilot or squadron could change the outcome, for the Hellcat existed in numbers, each plane as capable as the last. In theaters where attrition was inevitable, quantity married to quality ensured dominance. Losses were mitigated, missions could continue without hesitation, and the rhythm of warfare shifted inexorably in favor of those who mastered both machine and strategy. Reflecting on its legacy, The Hellcat exemplifies the core truths of warfare, that the deadliest force is not always the fastest, the most elegant or the most celebrated, but the one that endures, adapts, and emerges from conflict ready to fight again. It was an embodiment of preparation, engineering foresight, and tactical mastery, a predator built not for show, but for survival and triumph. By the time hostilities ceased, the skies had been irrevocably altered. The F6F Hellcat, once mocked in briefings and intelligence reports, had dominated oceans, destroyed adversaries, and safeguarded pilots who would go on to shape the next era of aerial warfare. It had proven a universal truth: resilience, discipline, and relentless design triumph over appearances. Arrogance and brute force alone. In the end, the Hellcat proved that in war, the deadliest predator is the one that always comes home.